for nearly 30 years after World War II ended. One Japanese soldier refused to believe it. Hidden deep within the Philippine jungle, he fought, he killed, and he survived. For an empire that no longer existed. December 1944, Lubang Island, Philippines. The war was reaching its breaking point. Allied forces were closing in, Japanese morale collapsing. But deep within the chaos, a 22-year-old intelligence officer named Hiroo Onoda received one final order, an order that would define the rest of his life. You are to conduct guerrilla warfare and never surrender. You are forbidden to die by your own hand. Those words became his creed, his law, his curse. Hiroo Onoda wasn't a typical soldier. He'd been trained by Japan's elite intelligence school. Specialists in psychological warfare, sabotage, and deception. To him, surrender wasn't just defeat. It was betrayal, a stain that could never be washed away. When the US invaded Lubang, the Japanese garrison collapsed. Most soldiers were killed or captured. But Onoda vanished into the jungle with 3 others. The war ended in 1945. Leaflets rained from the sky announcing Japan's surrender. But Onoda studied the papers carefully and decided they were fake. "This is American propaganda," he wrote in his journal. "The war cannot be over. The emperor would never surrender." So he and his men continued their mission, destroying supplies, attacking locals, hiding by day, hunting by night. To them, every voice, every airplane, every stranger was the enemy. Months became years. The island changed. New villages grew. The war dead were buried. But deep in the forest, gunfire still echoed. Onoda's group lived off coconuts, stolen rice, and jungle pigs. They patched their uniforms with vines and bark. In 1950, one of his men surrendered. Onoda called him a coward. The others disappeared one by one, either dead or captured. By 1959, only Onoda remained. Villagers began reporting a Japanese ghost haunting the jungle. Every few months, someone's cow went missing. Hunters vanished. Police searched the forests and found traces. Old ration cans, footprints, even freshly oiled weapons. But they never found the man himself. When Japanese newspapers reported a lone soldier still fighting in the Philippines, most readers laughed. A hoax, they said, an urban legend. But Japan's military archives had no record of Onoda's death. So the mystery grew. Who was this man still carrying a rifle? 30 years after the war, Onoda lived like a phantom. He kept his rifle clean. He polished his uniform. He read the tattered field manual every night, as though the war's code still mattered. His reality was unshakable. The war never ended. Every sound outside his camp was an ambush. Every voice a deception. In his mind, he was still obeying orders. The world had moved on, but Onoda hadn't. In 1974, nearly 30 years after the war, a young Japanese explorer named Norio Suzuki traveled to Lubang Island. His mission? To find Lieutenant Onoda, a panda, and the abominable snowman, in that order. Locals warned him not to go, but he trekked deep into the jungle with nothing but a camera, a sleeping bag, and courage. What he found would shock the world. For hours, the two stared at each other, one representing the world of peace, the other trapped in a war that never ended. Finally, Onoda lowered his rifle. Suzuki bowed deeply and said, "The war is over." Onoda didn't answer. He just whispered, "If that is true, show me my commander." The jungle fell silent. That moment was the beginning of the end of the longest one-man war in history. The man who refused to surrender had finally been found. But how do you convince a soldier who's lived 29 years in a fantasy that the war ended decades ago? For 3 days, Norio Suzuki and Hiroo Onoda spoke in fragments, coded military phrases, old maps, cryptic stories of the emperor. Onoda tested Suzuki, asking questions about Tokyo, about who was prime minister, about the state of the empire. Each wrong answer meant danger. Each correct one was met with silence. Suzuki realized that nothing he said would change Onoda's mind. The soldier's orders were absolute. Hold the island until relieved by your commanding officer. So Suzuki promised to return with that officer. When he left the jungle, Onoda vanished again. When Suzuki returned to Japan, his story spread like wildfire. A soldier still fighting World War II. The newspapers called him the ghost of Lubang. The government called it impossible. But then, Onoda's old commander, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, came forward. He was now a bookseller, retired, gray-haired. But when he read the report, he whispered, "He's still waiting for me." Japan sent Taniguchi to Lubang with one purpose, to release Onoda from duty. On March 9, 1974, the old officer stepped off the helicopter and entered the jungle where his soldier waited. For hours, there was nothing but the sound of insects and rain. Then, a shadow appeared among the trees. Onoda emerged wearing the same uniform he had in 1945, patched with bark, polished with oil. He saluted Taniguchi with perfect military form. Taniguchi read the order. All combat activities are to cease immediately. You are to lay down your arms. Onoda stood silent. Then slowly, he unbuckled his rifle, placed it on the ground, and wept. When Onoda finally emerged from the jungle, cameras flashed, reporters swarmed. The man who had refused to surrender for 29 years looked thin, calm, and utterly composed. He apologized to the Philippine people for the lives he had taken, saying, "I regret nothing. I did my duty." The world was stunned. Some saw him as a hero of loyalty, others as a man trapped by delusion. Psychologists called it temporal dislocation, the mind freezing in time under trauma. But to Onoda, it wasn't madness. It was faith. For nearly 3 decades, he had lived in a world built entirely on one idea, that the emperor's command was eternal, that the world outside his jungle was a lie. When the truth emerged, it was darker than anyone expected. Over his 29 years, Onoda had killed 30 villagers and wounded dozens more. To the locals, he wasn't a hero. He was a ghost who hunted them. Yet the Philippine president, Ferdinand Marcos, forgave him, declaring his acts were under military orders. The man walked free. Onoda's return to Tokyo felt like time travel. Neon lights, high-rise buildings, fast food, rock music. He had left an empire of honor and returned to a nation obsessed with consumption. He said quietly to a journalist, "Japan has changed. I am still the same." Onoda struggled to adapt. He tried to find purpose, wrote a memoir, spoke publicly, but always referred to himself in the past tense. The soldier I once was. Years later, he left Japan again, this time for Brazil. He started a cattle ranch deep in the wilderness. Another jungle, another exile. When asked why, he smiled. "I feel at peace when I am surrounded by trees." But there's one mystery that remains. Onoda never fully admitted he was wrong. He said, "I obeyed my orders to the end. The world changed, I did not." Some historians believe he knew the war was over, but couldn't face a life without purpose, that his endless mission became his identity. And letting go of it meant dying. In 2014, Hiroo Onoda passed away peacefully at 91, but his story continues to echo, a haunting question carved into history itself. At what point does loyalty become madness? Because sometimes the hardest war to end is the one we fight within ourselves. In the next chapter, we uncover how Onoda's story was just one of many. The forgotten soldiers who refused to surrender, and the secret missions Japan never officially acknowledged. The hunt for the lost soldiers begins. The world believed Hiroo Onoda was the last one. But they were wrong. Across the Pacific, in the forgotten corners of islands and jungles, there were others. Still fighting, still hiding, still loyal to a vanished emperor. After Onoda's surrender in 1974, Japan realized something chilling. Dozens of soldiers had vanished after the war and were never officially confirmed dead. Files were reopened, records cross-checked, names began to surface. The Onoda case wasn't unique. It was just the first to be caught on camera. By 1975, the Japanese government had quietly launched Operation Phantom Return, a classified mission to locate and recover missing imperial soldiers still believed to be alive in the Pacific. Intelligence reports from the Philippines, Indonesia, and Guam spoke of ghost soldiers, men in tattered uniforms sighted at night who fired warning shots and vanished. Most of these stories were dismissed as myths, but not all. In December 1974, just months after Onoda's return, another soldier was found, Teruo Nakamura, hiding on the Indonesian island of Morotai. Unlike Onoda, Nakamura was not ethnically Japanese. He was Taiwanese, conscripted during the war. For 29 years, he lived completely alone in a small bamboo hut, surviving on bananas and stolen crops. When soldiers approached, he didn't resist. He simply raised his hands and said, "I waited for you." But Nakamura's story was not celebrated. Because of his ethnicity, he received none of the hero's welcome given to Onoda. Within weeks of his return, he was forgotten, a ghost among headlines. He died quietly 4 years later, his name barely mentioned in history books. It revealed an uncomfortable truth. Even in loyalty, there were hierarchies of honor. As word spread, more reports surfaced. On Guam, 2 soldiers, Shoichi Yokoi and Kinshichi Kozuka, had been discovered years earlier, living underground in handmade burrows. Yokoi's words upon capture became legendary. "It is with much embarrassment that I return." His body was frail, his uniform intact, his belief unbroken. Across every case, one chilling pattern stood out. All had refused to believe Japan had surrendered. All had stayed in isolated pockets of forest or mountain terrain. And all had survived on the same unshakable conviction that to surrender was to die without honor. The imperial code had done what no bullet could. It imprisoned them in time. Decades later, declassified Japanese military archives revealed something astonishing. In 1944, officers had issued a set of verbal orders to small unit commanders. Even if Japan falls, fight on independently. No expiration date, no instructions for surrender. The result was chaos. Hundreds of men scattered across islands with no way to confirm peace. Their loyalty wasn't madness, it was design. The US military had dropped millions of surrender leaflets across the Pacific, but many were poorly translated or contained printing errors. Soldiers like Onoda and Yokoi thought they were fakes. One leaflet famously said, "The war ended on August 15th, 1945. You may come down safely." To a mind trained in deception, that was proof the enemy was lying. So they stayed hidden. In the years after the war, Philippine and Indonesian villagers continued to report attacks. Crops burned, animals killed, supplies stolen. Some even found messages carved into trees. "We will not surrender. The Imperial Army lives." The war had ended on paper, but in the jungles, it raged on like a haunting echo. Behind every phantom soldier was a broken chain of communication. Orders never retracted, faith never questioned. Psychologists later compared it to cult behavior. Once the worldview was absolute, no evidence could break it. These men weren't fighting enemies anymore. They were fighting reality itself. The story of Japan's lost soldiers became a global phenomenon. Some saw it as a testament to loyalty and discipline. Others called it the ultimate tragedy of blind obedience. One American historian wrote, "They weren't fighting for victory anymore. They were fighting to preserve meaning." And perhaps that's what made their stories so haunting. In the 1970s, Japan was booming. Skyscrapers, cars, and color TV. Yet, while the nation raced toward modernity, its ghosts were still being pulled from the jungle. The old code of Bushido, loyalty, honor, death before surrender, was now a relic. But the men who lived by it could not escape it. When the last soldier came home, Japan thought the ghost war was finally over. But decades later, historians uncovered evidence of something deeper. A secret intelligence project buried in the archives, hinting that the emperor's last message might not have been what the world believed. They called him the Last Samurai. But to those who truly knew him, Hiroo Onoda wasn't a legend. He was a man haunted by a war that never left his mind. When Onoda returned to Japan in 1974, millions celebrated him as a symbol of loyalty. But in private, officials didn't know what to do with him. He was a soldier trained to fight, not to live in peace. The emperor himself granted him a personal pardon. Yet, behind the ceremony, Japan's government was quietly uneasy. Onoda had become a mirror, reflecting an old Japan that the new one wanted to forget. In the weeks that followed, Onoda met the families of those he'd fought beside. Some wept, others turned away. His surviving comrade's widow said only one thing: "He came home, but my husband never did." The applause that greeted his arrival began to fade. Onoda realized he'd survived the war, but lost his place in the world. Japan in the 1970s was no longer a warrior nation. The economy was booming. Television was everywhere. Students protested militarism. The young saw Onoda not as a hero, but as a relic. Yet the old men in uniform whispered, "He kept faith when we could not." Onoda tried to live quietly. He wrote an autobiography, No Surrender, My 30-Year War, trying to explain himself. But between the lines, you can feel the distance. A man unable to connect to a time that moved without him. In 1975, he moved to Brazil, bought land, and built a small cattle ranch surrounded by forest. He told a reporter, "I feel at peace when the jungle is near. It listens." In interviews, Onoda never expressed regret. He spoke of loyalty, duty, and honor, words that had lost meaning in the modern world. When asked if the emperor's order was worth 29 years of isolation, he paused and said, "I did what I was trained to do. I protected my command. That was my truth." It wasn't defiance. It was conviction, the final echo of a dying code. Decades later, Onoda returned to Japan one last time. He visited schools, teaching children about resilience and responsibility. Some admired him. Others saw only the darkness, a man shaped by indoctrination. Yet, when asked what lesson he wanted the next generation to learn, he said softly, "Question your orders. even the ones that sound noble. The warrior had learned what the war never taught him: doubt. As he aged, Onoda became more reflective. He founded a survival school to teach discipline and endurance. Yet friends noticed his obsession with routine, waking before dawn, polishing his tools, inspecting the grounds like a military camp. The war had ended for the world, but inside him, it still marched on. In one of his last interviews, Onoda said something few expected. "If I had known the truth in 1945, I would have fought one more battle against myself." The statement puzzled journalists, but scholars understood. For Onoda, surrender was never about laying down arms. It was about facing the unbearable weight of reality. In January 2014, at the age of 91, Hiroo Onoda passed away in Tokyo. His funeral was simple: no military parade, no public spectacle. Just a photograph, a uniform, and a folded flag. Yet across Japan, thousands visited his grave. Some left flowers, others left letters. And one note read, "You never surrendered. We never forgot." Today, Onoda's story stands at the intersection of history and myth. Was he a hero of loyalty, or a victim of fanaticism? A man of unbreakable faith, or of tragic blindness? Maybe both. Because the line between honor and obsession is thin, and war erases it completely. If there's one truth to take from this story, it's this: some wars never end. They just change form. For Onoda, the jungle became his world, because it was the only place where the past still made sense. For the rest of us, his story is a warning. Blind loyalty can turn belief into a prison. And sometimes, the bravest act is to question the orders we're given. Somewhere in the jungles he once patrolled, vines have reclaimed his old hideouts. The camps are silent. The rifles are rusted. But if you listen closely, you can almost hear it: the echo of a soldier still standing guard over a world that's long gone. The last samurai, who never truly came home. History has a way of forgetting those who refuse to change. But stories like this remind us how fragile truth can be, and how far a single belief can carry a man. If you believe the world should remember the people history left behind, subscribe. Because the next forgotten story might be one no one else will ever tell.